So let's translate those layers that we saw on the previous slide onto this diagram. We said that the innermost layer, layer 8, was the parietal peritoneum. So that's this layer here. Outside of that, we said was the extraperitoneal layer. We called that layer 7. So that's over here, and we said that's where the testis develops. Outside of that, we said was the transversalis fascia. We called that layer 6, so that would be this layer. Outside of that is the transversus abdominis layer. And remember, we said it's going to have a muscle. It's going to have an aponeurosis, and the muscle and aponeurosis are going to be covered over by fascia, as you can see on this illustration. Outside of that, we said was the internal oblique layer. We called that layer 4. Again, muscle, aponeurosis, and fascia. And we also said that layers 4 and 5 would be fused together. And on this illustration here, it shows those layers fusing together over here. In reality, they're actually fused together even further lateral than that. But they're shown separately here, so you'll recognize that they are initially 2 layers. And then outside of that, we have layer 3, which we said was the external oblique layer. And in this diagram, we don't see any muscle because the external oblique muscle ends much more lateral than is shown on this picture. So what we see here is just the aponeurosis covered by fascia. And then layers 1 and 2, the skin and superficial fascia, have been removed from this diagram so that we can see everything that we're looking at. And so we said that the testis develops in the extraperitoneal layer, wants to move in this direction toward the superficial side of the abdominal wall, and the first layer it encounters will be the transversalis fascia. And we said that what it's going to do is evaginate that fascia, and the point at which it evaginates the fascia is going to be called the deep inguinal ring. So right here, that deep inguinal ring is a point of evagination where the testis that was here migrates outward, and it drags that transversalis fascia along with it and ends up being covered by it. Now, not only is that transversalis fascia covering the testis that's descending, but since as the testis descends, it drags along with it all of those other structures that a testis needs to have, such as a ductus deferens and a testicular artery and testicular vein and lymphatics and nerves and so forth. All of those structures get dragged behind by the testis, and that's what we end up calling the spermatic cord. So not only does this evagination of fascia cover the testis, but it also covers the spermatic cord. And that evagination of the transversalis fascia is now given a new name, and it's called the internal spermatic fascia. So here we see the internal spermatic fascia, which gets evaginated from the transversalis fascia at the deep inguinal ring, and we see that it is now covering the spermatic cord. And if we followed this all the way down to the end, it would be covering the testis as well. So that gets the testis 1/3 of the way out. It got it from inside here in layer 7 into the plane between layer 6 and layer 5 by evaginating layer 6. And we now call that evagination internal spermatic fascia. So the next thing that we have to do is figure out how to get past the combined layers 4 and 5. And we'll just deal with layer 4 because whatever we say about 4 would apply to 5 as well, so we can just do this once. So let's pay attention to how the internal oblique layer is constructed. We said it will have a muscle, so here we can see the internal oblique muscle occupying that layer. Now, when we look at the arrangement of the muscle fibers on the surface of the abdominal wall in the internal oblique layer, we'll see that these muscle fibers are arranged in an oblique fashion, hence the name internal oblique, and it's an oblique arrangement such that the fibers are running upward and medialward. And that's the direction of the internal oblique muscle fibers. However, as we continue following this layer medially, we'll see that the direction of these muscle fibers is going to start to change. And shortly before we get to the most medial end of the internal oblique muscle, we see that the muscle fibers, instead of running upward and medially, start to arch around, form an arch-like arrangement. Now, the name that we apply to anatomical structures that have an arching orientation such as that is the word falx. You're familiar in the cranial cavity. There's something called the falx cerebri and falx cerebelli, components of the dura. And those are arching-shaped structures. So here we have arching-shaped muscle fibers, and it's in the inguinal region, so we call it the falx inguinalis. So these internal oblique muscle fibers take on this arching arrangement of the falx inguinalis and thereby leave a gap under themselves, a gap under the falx inguinalis where there is no muscle. And that is a convenient arrangement because we want to have a place where this descending testis is going to be able to get past layer 4 without the muscle fibers getting in the way. And so the testis can pass under the falx inguinalis. However, recall that this internal oblique muscle is covered over by fascia on the inner and outer surfaces, the internal oblique fascia. And in this region, under the falx inguinalis, even though there is no muscle fiber there, we still have the internal oblique fascia there. So this gap under the falx inguinalis is not an empty gap, but rather it's a gap covered over by the internal oblique fascia, which means that as the testis is descending and passes under the falx inguinalis, it's going to have to evaginate that fascia, just as it evaginated the fascia of the transversalis fascial layer up here, and take that fascia with it. So the same thing is going to happen here, that descending testis and its spermatic cord evaginates fascia, evaginates the fascia here. Now, as it evaginates that internal oblique fascia, some of these very last muscle fibers, the muscle fibers on the edge of the falx inguinalis, get caught up with that internal oblique fascia, and those muscle fibers get evaginated as well, like that. So what gets evaginated as the testis passes under the falx inguinalis is not just the fascia of the internal oblique layer, but actually some of the muscle fibers of the internal oblique layer as well. Those evaginated internal oblique muscle fibers take on the name cremaster muscle, and that's going to be a skeletal muscle that will be used to control the position of the testis and spermatic cord in the scrotum as a thermoregulatory mechanism. And since we have this general rule that fascia that covers muscle always has the same name as the muscle, therefore, if we're calling this the cremaster muscle, the fascia will now be called the cremasteric fascia. So the internal oblique muscle and fascia that gets evaginated changes its name to the cremaster muscle and fascia. So now at this point, we have the testis and the spermatic cord that's being dragged behind, covered by 2 layers. We have covered by 1 layer that it picked up as it evaginated the transversalis fascia layer at the deep ring, and then it picks up a second layer, a second covering, as it passes under the falx inguinalis, and that second covering is called the cremasteric muscle and fascia. So now we're 2/3 of the way out, and so the last thing that we have to do is figure out how to get past layer 3, the external oblique layer. Now, as I said previously, in this region, the external oblique layer is represented only by aponeurosis and fascia. There is no muscle because the muscle ends much further laterally. So we have this tendon or the aponeurosis covered by fascia. And the testis needs a way to get through that aponeurosis. And as it turns out, there is a hole in the aponeurosis. There's a hole right there. The name of that hole is the superficial inguinal ring. So the hole in the aponeurosis provides a pathway for the testis and the spermatic cord being dragged behind to come out. But even though there is a hole in the aponeurosis, a hole in the tendon, there is no hole in the fascia, the external oblique fascia that's covering the aponeurosis, which means that that superficial inguinal ring is covered over by a layer of fascia, specifically the external oblique fascia. So as the testis and spermatic cord pass through that superficial inguinal ring, it will evaginate that fascia, just as it already did here and already did here. And so it will pick up a third layer of fascia, an outermost layer of fascia, and that evaginated fascia is going to be called the external spermatic fascia. The external spermatic fascia. So we now have the testis and spermatic cord covered by 3 layers of fascia, one here, second one here, and the third one there. And we have this pathway that we've created that started at the deep inguinal ring here and ends at the superficial inguinal ring here. We can think of it as sort of a tunnel with one end of the tunnel here and one end of the tunnel here. And that tunnel or pathway is now called the inguinal canal, starting at the deep ring, ending at the superficial ring. And as the testis and spermatic cord traverses each component of that tunnel, it picks up another layer of fascia and ends up covered by 3 layers. So what we see in the coverings of the spermatic cord are 3 layers of fascia, which are labeled here, and each layer of fascia covering the spermatic cord corresponds to a component of the abdominal wall that we passed through. So what's labeled as number 3 here, which is the internal spermatic fascia, is exactly the same as the transversalis fascia. What's labeled as 2 here, which is the cremasteric muscle and fascia, is simply the evagination of the internal oblique muscle and fascia. And what's labeled as number 1 here, the external spermatic fascia, is exactly the same as the external oblique fascia covering the external oblique aponeurosis. So that's the pathway for the descent of the testis. And so that now allows us to begin our discussion of hernias.